The courtroom was quiet, but it was not the kind of quiet that came with peace. It was the tense, heavy silence of a room full of people waiting for something unusual to happen. The air felt thick with anticipation. A handful of reporters sat poised with their notebooks. Jurors shuffled nervously in their seats, and attorneys on both sides prepared their papers. But no one was truly focused on the legal proceedings just yet. All eyes were on the door. That morning, the judge had announced a surprising decision. A 3-year-old child would be permitted to testify in the trial. It was not unheard of, but it was rare, almost unthinkable. The case itself was serious, involving events no child should have had to witness. But this tiny girl, Emily, was the only one who had seen enough to confirm the truth. She was not just a witness, she was the key. The door creaked open, and heads turned instantly. In walked a woman, Emily's guardian, holding the small hand of a little girl, whose golden curls bounced gently as she shuffled forward. Emily wore a simple blue dress, clutched a worn stuffed bunny in her arm, and walked with hesitant steps that echoed against the polished floor. She looked far too young, far too fragile, to carry the weight of such a responsibility. But Emily was not alone. Beside her, padding quietly on large paws, was Max, a fully trained police dog. His golden coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his calm, steady demeanor contrasted sharply with the nervous energy in the room. Some jurors leaned forward with curiosity. Others frowned, unsure why a dog had been allowed in a court of law. The judge cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will notice that Officer Max has been permitted to accompany the witness. This court recognizes the unique needs of child witnesses, and in this case, it has been deemed appropriate for Max to provide comfort and support. The court expects no disruption." Whispers rippled across the benches. Reporters scribbled furiously. A police dog in court was not a common sight, and everyone could feel the story growing before their eyes. Emily's guardian gently guided her to the witness stand, but the child hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room, wide and fearful. The wooden stand towered over her, and the strangers surrounding her felt overwhelming. She tightened her grip on her stuffed bunny. Her lips trembled. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, wondering if she would freeze before the questioning even began. Then Max did something subtle but powerful. He stepped forward, brushing against Emily's leg with the side of his body. His handler, sitting quietly near the bench, gave a small nod, allowing Max to move closer. Emily looked down at him, her eyes softening as his warm presence reached her. She bent slightly and pressed her free hand against his head. For the first time since entering the room, Emily took a steady breath. The jury noticed. The defense attorneys exchanged skeptical glances, but a flicker of concern passed across their faces. They had been confident that the child would never speak, that her fear would silence her and collapse the case. But seeing the way she responded to the dog gave them pause. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Proceed," he instructed. The prosecutor, a woman with years of experience, but an unmistakable nervousness in her tone, stepped forward. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to Emily's level, and offered a warm smile. "Hello, Emily," she said softly. "Do you remember me? We talked a little bit before." Emily's eyes flickered toward the prosecutor, then back down to Max. She gave the faintest nod but said nothing. Her tiny fingers twisted the ear of her stuffed bunny. "That's all right," the prosecutor continued gently. "We don't have to rush. Do you see Max here? He's going to sit with you the whole time. He's very good at listening. Isn't he?" Emily hesitated again, then gave a tiny smile, barely visible, but real. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't gone, but it cracked just enough to let in a sliver of hope. Still, the defense attorney leaned back in his chair, smug. He whispered to his co-counsel, "The girl won't talk. Watch. The dog won't make her speak. But those who watched closely could see that Max had already begun working his quiet magic. He was not just sitting idly. He was present, alert, radiating a sense of safety. His eyes stayed locked on Emily's face, as though waiting for her to trust him completely. The prosecutor asked another question. Simple, harmless. "Emily, do you like dogs?" Emily finally whispered, "Yes." It was so soft that the microphone barely caught it, but it was enough. The first word had been spoken. A ripple of emotion passed through the courtroom. Some jurors smiled faintly. Others let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. A judge himself allowed a small nod, acknowledging the progress. Emily's guardian wiped a tear from her eye. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably this time. One word was not much, but it was more than he had expected. The prosecutor smiled gently. "I thought so. Max likes you too. He's very happy to sit with you today." Emily reached out again, stroking Max's fur. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed just slightly, and her tiny lips curved into another brief, hesitant smile. It was a small moment ordinary to anyone else, but in the high-stakes world of that courtroom, it felt monumental. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. For all his years of experience, he had rarely seen such a delicate balance of law and humanity play out before him. This was no ordinary testimony. This was a test of courage for a child who should never have had to carry such a burden. And as Max rested calmly beside Emily, the entire courtroom began to realize this case was no longer just about evidence and arguments. It was about whether a child's voice, fragile, hesitant, and innocent, could break through fear with the help of a loyal companion. What no one knew yet was that Emily's first whispered yes was only the beginning. The real testimony, the one that would change everything, had not yet begun. But the spark had been lit, and everyone in that courtroom, judge, jury, attorneys, reporters, would soon witness something they would never forget. The courtroom had held its breath when Emily spoke her first word, that tiny yes, in response to the prosecutor's gentle question. It had been little more than a whisper, but it carried more weight than any of the lengthy arguments made so far. It was a sign, small, fragile, but undeniable, that the child could speak. And yet, as the questioning went on, the truth quickly became clear. That single yes might be all Emily could manage. The prosecutor leaned in, her voice warm and soothing. "Emily, can you tell us your name?" Emily froze. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her tiny shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to shield herself from all the eyes staring at her. She clutched her stuffed bunny so tightly that its fabric ears twisted in her fists. Max, lying obediently at her feet, shifted slightly, placing his head on her lap. But still, Emily did not speak. The silence grew heavier. The jurors shifted in their seats again, their initial relief fading into concern. One older juror, a grandmother herself, pressed a tissue to her eyes, as if willing the child to find strength. But across the aisle, the defense attorneys leaned back comfortably, their confidence returning. The lead defense lawyer, Mr. Harlan, allowed himself a quiet smirk. This was exactly what he had predicted. He knew that children, especially one as young as 3, often froze under pressure. A courtroom was intimidating enough for adults' bright lights, stern faces, endless questions. For a toddler, it was nearly impossible. He leaned toward his co-counsel and whispered, "See? She can't do it. Case will collapse before it even begins." The prosecutor, however, refused to give up. She tried again. "Emily," she said softly, "I know it's a little scary here, but remember, you're not alone. Max is here. He's listening. Do you think Max is a good listener?" Emily's wide eyes darted around the room, then landed on Max. The big dog lifted his head, his calm brown eyes meeting hers. She reached down and stroked his fur, but she still didn't answer. The prosecutor paused. She could feel the tension building. The child's fear was so palpable, it seemed to radiate through the entire courtroom. Even those who wanted her to speak felt a pang of sympathy. No 3-year-old should have to carry this burden. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Counsel," he said firmly but kindly, "perhaps we need to reconsider. If the child is unable to communicate in this environment." But before he could finish, Emily let out a tiny sound. Not a word, but a whimper, soft and trembling. She turned and buried her face in Max's fur. The courtroom held still. "Emily?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded against Max's neck. But when the prosecutor tried to continue, asking if Emily remembered what happened that night, the little girl's body stiffened. Her face turned pale, her tiny fingers curled around Max's collar, and her lips pressed shut. Nothing. The silence returned, thicker than before. The defense attorney smirked again. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms smugly. This was exactly the failure he had been counting on. The jury, meanwhile, looked torn sympathetic to the child, but also uncertain whether she could provide what the case required. Without her testimony, the prosecution's argument would falter. The prosecutor bit her lip, realizing the danger. She had prepared for this, but preparation meant little when facing the raw fear of a child. She tried softer questions, circling around the subject, but Emily only gave small nods or shook her head, still refusing to speak. Minutes passed. The silence became unbearable. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, recording the dramatic pause in the trial. Some described the scene as heartbreaking, others as hopeless. One even wrote the headline in advance, "Star witness too young to testify." The judge rubbed his forehead, glancing at the clock. The case had barely begun, and already it was teetering on collapse. He considered calling a recess, perhaps even dismissing the child entirely. The thought weighed heavily on him, for he knew how critical her role was. But then he looked at Emily Small, trembling, clutching her stuffed bunny in one hand and Max's fur in the other. She looked like she wanted to speak, but simply couldn't force the words out. She was not unwilling. She was terrified. Max seemed to know it too. He shifted again, this time nudging Emily's arm gently with his nose. She blinked, startled, then looked into his steady eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, as though the dog was telling her, "It's okay. I'm here." Still, Emily remained silent. The defense lawyer grew bold. He stood abruptly. "Your Honor," he said in a sharp tone, "it's clear the witness is incapable of testifying. This child is 3 years old. This is a courtroom, not a nursery. We cannot waste this jury's time with silence." The words cut through the room like a blade. Emily flinched at his voice, shrinking smaller in her seat. Her guardian, seated nearby, looked furious but powerless to intervene. The judge frowned, his gavel striking the bench lightly. "Mr. Harlan, sit down. This court will not tolerate disrespect toward a child witness." But Harlan's words had left their mark. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. Some jurors looked doubtful again. The weight of Emily's silence was beginning to feel insurmountable. The prosecutor tried once more, her voice trembling now with urgency. "Emily," she whispered, "you don't have to be afraid. Max is here. You can talk to him, if that's easier. You don't even have to look at me. Just talk to Max." Emily looked at the dog. The courtroom held its breath. But Emily pressed her face against his fur again and stayed quiet. The defense lawyer's smirk widened. The silence stretched on. And yet, to those who watched closely, there was something happening beneath that silence. Emily's little hand was no longer trembling quite as violently. Her breathing, though still shaky, was slowing. Her eyes, though downcast, lingered on Max's calm face. Something was shifting inside her. It was not visible to the impatient defense, nor to the skeptical jurors. But Max knew. The dog stayed perfectly still, giving Emily the space she needed, silently promising he would not leave her side. The breakthrough had not come yet, but the silence, painful, frustrating, unbearable, was not empty. It was the silence before a storm. A silence that would soon be broken in a way no one in that courtroom could have predicted. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The prosecutor's words hung unanswered, the jury shifted uneasily in their seats, and the defense attorney's smug grin deepened by the second. To the casual eye, it looked like the trial was unraveling. The child's fear was winning. But in the midst of that silence, there was one steady presence, Max, the police dog. Unlike the humans around him, Max was not flustered, impatient, or burdened by legal expectations. He was calm, grounded, and utterly focused on the tiny girl who sat trembling beside him. His training had prepared him for this years of working with children, victims and survivors who needed comfort in their hardest moments. And right now, Emily was his mission. Emily sat hunched in the wooden chair, her small frame dwarfed by the high-backed seat. Her fingers twisted the fabric of her stuffed bunny until its seams strained. Her lips stayed pressed tightly together. The prosecutor had stopped asking questions for fear of pushing her too hard, and the judge leaned back, torn between duty and compassion. The courtroom was tense, but Max moved with quiet certainty. He shifted slightly, inching closer to Emily. His golden coat brushed against her knees. She glanced down, startled at first, but his eyes met hers, deep, steady, and reassuring. Her breath hitched, but then something remarkable happened. Her tiny hand let go of the bunny, just for a moment, and reached down to touch Max's head. It was small, almost imperceptible, but for Emily, it was the first step out of fear. The jury noticed. Several of them leaned forward, watching with wide eyes. The defense lawyer scoffed quietly, but his confidence wavered for the first time. He had not expected the dog to matter this much. Emily stroked Max's fur slowly, her little fingers sinking into his thick coat. Her shoulders relaxed, if only slightly, and her breathing steadied. She bent down, leaning closer to him. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to vanish. And then, in the faintest whisper, she spoke. No one could hear her words. Not the jury. Not the attorneys. Not even the judge. But Max heard. His ears twitched, and he remained perfectly still, listening with the patience only a dog could hold. Gasps rippled across the courtroom as people realized what was happening. The girl who had sat in silence for so long was talking not to the lawyers, not to the judge, but to Max. The prosecutor's heart leapt. She had read about therapy dogs bridging this gap, but seeing it unfold was beyond belief. She looked at the handler, who gave a small nod. It was working. Emily's lips moved again, her voice muffled as she leaned into Max's ear. She was sharing her secret, the truth that had been locked inside her since that terrible night. She could not tell the stern adults who stared at her, but she could tell Max. Max would not judge. Max would not frighten her. Max simply listened. For several seconds, the room remained frozen. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and Emily's soft whispers into Max's ear. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. He muttered to his co-counsel, "She's not testifying. She's babbling to a dog. This is ridiculous." But his voice carried less certainty now. Something about the sight of the little girl trusting the dog shook even him. The handler leaned forward gently. "Emily," he said softly, his voice kind and patient. "You're doing so good. Max loves listening to you. Do you think you could tell Max again? but just a little louder, so we can hear too." Emily hesitated. Her wide eyes darted nervously to the jury, then back to Max. The fear began to creep in again, her small body tightening. But Max didn't move. He sat like a rock, steady and calm, his gaze locked on hers. Emily's hand clutched his fur tighter, and after a long pause, she nodded. She took a shaky breath. Her voice trembled, small and fragile, but this time it was audible. "I saw him." The courtroom froze. The words were faint, but clear enough for the microphone to catch. A collective gasp rose from the jurors and spectators. The prosecutor's eyes widened, while the defense attorney's smirk finally faltered. Emily's voice wavered, but she kept going, her hand never leaving Max's fur. "I saw him. That night. I saw what he did." The prosecutor resisted the urge to push for details, knowing any pressure might send Emily back into silence. Instead, she let the child's courage unfold at its own pace. Emily bent down again, burying her face in Max's neck. She whispered more words, details too painful for someone so small. Max remained still, absorbing every syllable. Slowly, with gentle encouragement from the handler, Emily repeated those words out loud. The jury leaned forward, listening intently. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others wiped their eyes. The sight of a 3-year-old speaking truth with the help of a dog was unlike anything they had ever seen. Even the judge leaned forward, his stern face softened with compassion. In all his years on the bench, he had witnessed countless testimonies, but none so raw, so pure, and so moving. Emily's voice grew stronger with each sentence. The first words had been shaky, but now there was rhythm, a flow born from trust. She no longer looked at the attorneys or the jury. She looked only at Max, as if the entire courtroom disappeared, and it was just the two of them, one frightened child, one loyal friend. The defense lawyer fumbled through his papers, his composure slipping. He whispered again to his co-counsel, "We can challenge this. She's a child, she's not credible." But even he knew the jury was not seeing a rehearsed script. They were seeing truth spoken in its rawest form. Emily continued, her tiny voice echoing louder than anyone had expected. The once impenetrable silence of the courtroom had been broken not by arguments, not by legal maneuvering, but by the presence of a dog who knew exactly how to give comfort. When Emily finally stopped, exhausted but calmer, she rested her cheek against Max's head. Her small chest rose and fell as though a heavy weight had been lifted. The prosecutor, her own eyes glistening, spoke softly. "Thank you, Emily. You are very brave." "And thank you, Max." The jury sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. For the first time since the trial began, the balance had shifted. And it all started with a dog placing his paw in the lap of a scared little girl. The silence that once threatened to destroy the case had been broken forever. The courtroom had changed. Only moments before, the atmosphere had been suffocating with silence, the weight of a child's fear pressing down on everyone present. But now, there was a shift, an almost invisible current of hope. Emily had spoken. Her words were fragile, trembling, but they were there. And she had spoken them not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, not to the jury, but to Max the dog at her side. Everyone in the room could feel it, the fragile thread of connection that bound the girl's courage to the steady presence of the golden-coated police dog. Emily leaned closer to Max again, pressing her face against his ear. Her lips moved, whispering secrets too heavy for her small shoulders. No one else could hear, but Max listened. His ears flicked at the sound, and he sat perfectly still, as if the entire courtroom had vanished, except for this one child. The handler, watching carefully, smiled gently. He knew this was the moment, the bridge between Emily's silence and the world's need for her words. He leaned forward and spoke softly. "You're doing so well, Emily. Max loves hearing you. Do you think maybe you could tell Max again, just a little louder, so the rest of us can hear too?" Emily froze. Her hand tightened in Max's fur, and for a moment, her wide eyes darted nervously around the room. There were so many faces: stern jurors, stone-faced lawyers, the towering judge. She shrank back, her lips trembling. The courage she had found seemed ready to slip away. But Max didn't move. His steady eyes locked on hers, and he lowered his head just enough to nuzzle her tiny hand. It was a silent promise. "I'm here. No one can hurt you. You're safe with me?" Emily's breath shook. She wanted to retreat, to fall back into the silence that had protected her for so long. But Max's calm gaze anchored her. Her little body trembled, but she nodded slowly. She took a deep breath. Her voice, so small it barely carried, slipped into the microphone. "I saw him." The words cut through the air like a bell. The courtroom gasped. Her tiny voice was shaky, almost broken, but it was audible. Every ear strained, every heart pounded. The jurors leaned forward, the prosecutor froze in anticipation, and even the judge's stern face softened. Emily's guardian stifled a sob. For weeks, the child had been unable to say anything at all about that night. Therapists, police officers, family, no one had been able to draw it from her. Yet here she was, speaking, her small hand clinging to the fur of a dog. The prosecutor, her voice trembling with both relief and care, whispered, "Emily, do you mean you saw the man in this courtroom?" Emily nodded. The defense attorney shot up instantly. "Objection," he barked. "This is outrageous, leading a child witness. Coercion." But the judge silenced him with a single stern look. "Sit down, Mr. Harlan. The objection is overruled. The witness may continue." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his smirk gone, replaced by unease. Emily turned back to Max, whispering again into his ear. Tears pooled in her eyes as the words tumbled out, words she had carried silently for far too long. The handler encouraged her gently, asking if she could tell Max one more time, but this time so the other good people could hear. Her lips trembled, but she pressed her cheek to Max's head and began to speak louder. "I saw what he did." The words cracked with emotion. She clutched Max tighter, burying her face in his fur before continuing. Her testimony came not in polished sentences, not in legal jargon, but in the raw, innocent language of a child. She spoke of a night filled with shadows, of loud voices, of fear. She described the way the man had acted, his movements, his words, details no 3-year-old could invent. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. Jurors wiped at their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, some barely able to write as their hands shook with the weight of the moment. Even hardened officers sat with clenched jaws, their eyes glistening. Emily did not look at them. She never once raised her gaze to the jury or the attorneys. She spoke only to Max, her small hands tangled in his fur, her forehead pressed against his neck. It was as if the world outside did not exist. Only Max existed. Only Max could carry the weight of her truth. The defense tried to object again, muttering about hearsay and credibility, but their voices felt hollow. Everyone in that room could see what was happening. A frightened child was finding her courage in the only way she knew how. And it was undeniable. The judge watched silently, his gavel unused. He knew this testimony was not ordinary, but it was real. Perhaps the most real testimony he had ever witnessed. Emily's voice cracked as she said the final words. "I was scared, but Max makes me brave." Her small body trembled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. But the words were out. The truth was out. The prosecutor, blinking back her own tears, spoke softly. "Thank you, Emily. You are very, very brave." Emily didn't respond. She simply hugged Max tighter, burying her tiny face in his fur. The courtroom remained utterly still, the weight of her words pressing down on every person in the room. And in that silence, it became clear the case had turned. The defense, once so confident, sat pale and silent. The jury, their faces etched with empathy, had heard what they needed to hear. The prosecutor felt the ground shift beneath her, the tide moving in her favor. And the judge, his hands folded in front of him, nodded gravely. What no one had expected, the child's breakthrough, had come not through cross-examination, not through legal strategy, but through a whisper into the ear of a dog. A whisper that became a voice, and a voice that changed everything. The moment Emily's words filled the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted permanently. It was as though a fragile dam had cracked, and a trickle of water had finally found its way through. Those first sentences, soft, trembling, whispered into Max's ear, before being spoken aloud, had broken a silence heavier than stone. Yet, even as the courtroom held its collective breath, one truth remained. Emily's whisper was not enough on its own. Her voice had opened the door, but the case needed more. The prosecutor knew it, the judge knew it, and even the jurors moved, though they were understood that the weight of justice demanded detail. But how could a 3-year-old possibly carry that burden? The prosecutor glanced at Max's handler. It wasn't her cross-examinations or carefully crafted questions that had made this breakthrough happen. It was the dog. The handler gave her a small nod, as if to say, "Trust him. Trust her." Emily sat curled against Max, her small hands tangled in his golden fur. She hadn't lifted her gaze from him since she had begun speaking. To her, the courtroom didn't exist anymore. It was just her and Max and the terrible secret she had held inside. The handler leaned forward gently. "Emily," he said softly, "you're doing amazing. Max hears you, and he's very proud. Do you think you can tell him a little more about what you saw? You don't have to tell us. You can tell him. He'll understand." Emily's lips trembled. She buried her face against Max's neck for a moment. Her tiny shoulders shook, and for a terrible second, it looked as if she might retreat back into silence. But Max didn't move. His stillness was its own kind of power. His heartbeat thudded steady beneath her small hands, a rhythm she could hold on to when everything else felt too big, too loud, too terrifying. Emily lifted her head, her cheeks wet with tears. She pressed her lips to Max's ear and began to whisper again. The courtroom strained in silence. No one could hear, but the way her lips moved, the way her small hands tightened in his fur, told them everything. She was speaking, pouring out the story she had been too afraid to tell. The handler smiled gently. "That's so good, Emily. Max heard you. You're very brave. Do you think you could say it again? A little louder, so the other good people can help too?" Emily hesitated, her wide eyes flicking up just enough to see the tall figures of the jury, the stern judge's face, the rows of strangers staring at her. Panic rippled across her features as she buried herself against Max once more. But then Max shifted, just slightly laying his head across her small lap. The weight was grounding. Emily sniffled, clutched him tighter, and whispered again, this time with her lips still brushing his fur, but loud enough for the microphone to catch. "He came into my room." The air vanished from the courtroom. Jurors sat motionless. The prosecutor's hand trembled as she gripped her pen. Emily's guardian covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Even the judge's usually composed expression cracked, his lips tightening as the gravity of the moment sank in. Emily's words, fragile as glass, painted the picture piece by piece. She spoke haltingly, each sentence a struggle, but each one more powerful than the last. "He was angry. He smelled like smoke. I tried to hide, but he saw me. Max remained perfectly still, his gaze locked on hers, his body a fortress of calm around her. The dog didn't flinch, didn't stir, didn't even blink. He simply let her hold on to him as she pushed through the weight of memory. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her small voice cracked, but she went on. He told me not to tell. He said he would hurt Mommy if I told. So I stayed quiet. The courtroom hung on every word. What no detective, no counselor, no relative had been able to coax from Emily was spilling out. Now, not because she trusted the courtroom, but because she trusted Max. The defense attorney shot to his feet again, desperate. Objection. This is completely inadmissible. The child is clearly overruled, the judge thundered, slamming his gavel. His voice shook with restrained emotion. The witness will continue. Emily flinched at the sound, burying herself once more in Max's neck. But Max didn't react, and his calm steadiness drew her back. Her tiny hand stroked his fur, as if reminding herself he was real, that he was there, that she wasn't alone. Her next words came in a broken whisper, but they cut sharper than any blade. He hurt me. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters shifted in their seats, unable to write fast enough. A juror pressed a hand against her lips, her face ashen. Emily sobbed now, clutching Max with both arms, her little body shaking. But she continued, between tears, describing the man, describing the room, describing things no child should ever have to describe. Every word stabbed into the silence, leaving behind the unmistakable mark of truth. And when she could speak no more, when her body trembled with exhaustion and grief, she pressed her face into Max's fur and whispered one last sentence. But I'm not scared now, because Max is here. The handler placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did it, Emily. Max heard everything. And now, so have we. The prosecutor swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, the witness has spoken with clarity and bravery beyond her years. Her testimony is clear and credible. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the child, who now clung to the golden retriever like a lifeline. It will be entered into record. The defense attorney looked pale, rattled, and shaken. His earlier bravado had evaporated under the undeniable power of the child's truth. Emily's guardian rushed forward, kneeling beside her, stroking her hair as the child cried silently into the dog's coat. The courtroom remained hushed, as if no one dared break the fragile sanctity of what had just happened. A 3-year-old had done the impossible. She had faced her terror, broken her silence, and spoken the truth, not through the rigid structure of a trial, but through the soft, steady presence of a dog who had given her the courage to be heard. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew the trial would never be the same again. The courtroom was still vibrating with the weight of Emily's testimony. For the first time, her truth had been spoken aloud raw, halting but undeniable. Everyone present had felt it, and for many, it was impossible to imagine how the defense could possibly recover. But defense attorneys were trained for storms like this. Mr. Harlan, the defendant's lawyer, sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched tight. His client had turned pale during Emily's testimony, shifting uncomfortably as the child described scenes only the guilty could know. Harlan had seen jurors glance at his client with new eyes, judgmental, skeptical, some even furious. That shift terrified him, but he couldn't let it show. He leaned forward, whispering urgently to his client, then stood, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy silence. Your Honor, I request permission to cross-examine the witness. The words sent a ripple of unease through the courtroom. The prosecutor's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. She is 3 years old, she shot back. Cross-examining her in this condition is cruel and unnecessary. Harlan adjusted his tie, his face a mask of false calm. With all due respect, Your Honor, if her testimony is to be considered credible, it must also withstand scrutiny. The jury cannot convict a man on whispers and emotion alone. The judge hesitated, his gaze shifting toward Emily. She sat curled against Max, her tiny fist still gripping the golden dog's fur, as if it were a lifeline. Her face was streaked with tears, her breathing uneven. She looked impossibly small on the witness stand, dwarfed by the formality of the courtroom. But the law was the law. The judge's voice was heavy as he ruled. The defense may proceed, but counsel will keep the questioning brief and respectful. One wrong step, Mr. Harlan, and I will cut you off immediately. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor. The defense attorney approached slowly, like a predator circling prey. His footsteps echoed unnervingly, and Emily instinctively tightened her grip on Max. The dog's calm eyes followed Harlan, his body unmoving but watchful. Harlan forced a smile as he crouched slightly to lower himself closer to Emily's height. "Hello, Emily," he said in a voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You've been very brave today. But I just want to ask you a few little questions, all right?" Emily turned her face into Max's fur, refusing to look at him. Her silence spoke volumes. Harlan's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "You told us you saw a man that night. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? Sometimes children have very strong imaginations." Emily shook her head, her small voice muffled against Max. "I wasn't dreaming." Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. "But it was dark, wasn't it? Very dark. Isn't it possible you couldn't really see clearly?" Emily's tiny hand gripped Max tighter. She hesitated, then whispered into his ear again. The handler leaned forward, listening carefully. When Emily nodded, the handler spoke gently to the court. "She says there was a night light." She could see his face. The jury stirred. Harlan's lips tightened. He hadn't expected the dog to function as a bridge again. He tried another tactic. "Emily, you said the man was angry. But angry people can look like a lot of different people, can't they? Isn't it possible you're confused about who it really was?" Emily's lower lip trembled. She pressed her face harder into Max's fur. For a long moment, she said nothing. Harlan smirked, thinking he had planted enough doubt. But then, without lifting her face, Emily spoke. Her voice was small but steady. It was him. The courtroom froze. Slowly, Emily's tiny hand rose from Max's fur, trembling as she pointed. Her fingers stretched across the room straight at the defendant. Gasps erupted. The defendant shifted in his seat, his eyes wide with panic, before he quickly forced his expression back to blankness. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order!" Harlan's face flushed red. He tried to recover, fumbling for words. Children sometimes point without understanding the gravity of what they're doing. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must remember she is 3 years old. 3. She could be influenced by anyone, even unintentionally. But his words rang hollow. The jurors had seen the rawness of Emily's fear, the uncoached purity of her small voice. This was not a rehearsed accusation. It was truth born from courage. The prosecutor rose sharply. "Your Honor, this line of questioning has crossed into intimidation. The defense is attempting to discredit a child with trauma in order to shield a guilty man. I object to any further questioning." The judge's eyes burned with restrained fury. He turned to Harlan. "One more word in that tone, and you'll find yourself in contempt. This cross-examination is finished." The defense attorney's mouth opened as if to argue, but one look at the judge's face silenced him. He returned to his seat, defeated, his confidence rattled to the core. Emily, meanwhile, sagged into Max's fur, utterly drained. She had faced the predator in the room, not just the man she had feared in the dark, but the lawyer who had tried to twist her words, and she had stood firm. Not because she was fearless, but because she wasn't alone. Max remained her anchor, steady and strong, his presence a reminder that she wasn't powerless. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. A child too young to read, too small to understand legal jargon, had withstood the pressure of cross-examination. And she had done so with the help of a dog who had given her a voice. The jurors exchanged glances. Some wiped tears discreetly. Others leaned back, their expressions hardening as the pieces fell into place. They had seen enough to know what their verdict would mean. The prosecutor closed her notebook, her eyes never leaving Emily. She knew that whatever happened next, the truth had already been spoken, and it had been spoken in a way no one could forget. The judge, breaking the silence, said quietly, "This court will recess for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow morning." His gavel struck, and the courtroom slowly stirred back to life. Reporters rushed for the door. Lawyers shuffled their papers, and officers moved to escort the defendant out. But all eyes, before leaving, lingered one last time on the small child curled against Max, whispering softly into his ear as if thanking him for staying. And deep down, every person in that room knew the same thing. The defense had fought, but the battle was slipping from their grasp. The truth, once whispered, could not be silenced again. The courtroom was unusually still the next morning when the trial resumed. A sense of inevitability had settled over everyone, though none dared to speak it aloud. The events of the previous day, Emily's trembling testimony, her courage, her unwavering identification of the man who had hurt her hung over the room like a storm cloud that had already broken. The jurors filed in slowly, each carrying the weight of what they had seen and heard. Some avoided eye contact with the defendant, while others looked directly at him with expressions sharpened by quiet anger. What Emily had said could not be unseen or unheard. It clung to them, replaying in their minds like an echo they couldn't silence. The defendant sat rigid, his face pale, his jaw locked. The swagger he had worn at the start of the trial was gone. Even his expensive suit couldn't hide the sheen of sweat on his forehead or the tension radiating from his body. His attorney whispered furiously in his ear, but his eyes darted nervously toward the jury box, as though searching for even one sympathetic glance. None came. At the front, Emily sat once more with Max. She looked exhausted. Her small body slumped against the golden retriever, but there was a peace about her that hadn't been there before. The night before, her guardian had said she had slept through without nightmares for the first time in weeks. And now, in the cold light of morning, her hand rested calmly on Max's head, as if she knew the hardest part was already behind her. The judge struck his gavel, and the trial pressed on. Closing arguments begin. The prosecutor rose first. She took a moment before speaking, her eyes moving across the faces of the jury. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but filled with quiet emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "yesterday you witnessed something extraordinary. You saw a 3-year-old girl, one of the youngest. Witnesses this courtroom has ever seen find the courage to speak the truth. Not because she was coached, not because she was manipulated, but because she finally felt safe. Safe enough to whisper her secret to a dog, and then safe enough to share it with all of us." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. Think about what it takes for a child that young to carry such fear. To live in silence because she believed harm would come to her family if she spoke. And yet, in that very silence, she carried the evidence we all needed. Her truth is not just believable, it is undeniable. The prosecutor stepped closer to the jury box. The defense will tell you she's too young, that her memory isn't reliable. But let me ask you, do children this young invent trauma? Do they fabricate nightmares so vivid they tremble when they recall them? Or do they simply tell what they saw in the only way they know how? She gestured softly toward Emily, still stroking Max. She didn't point across this room because she was confused. She pointed because she knew. Because the face she saw in her room that night is the same face sitting before you now. Her voice broke slightly, though she steadied it quickly. You have the power to protect her, to show her that her voice matters, that the truth matters, that the law protects the most vulnerable among us. She ended with a whisper that carried through the silent courtroom. Believe her. Because she believed in us enough to speak. The jurors sat in stunned quiet. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man in the back clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the wood of the jury box railing. The defense strikes back when the prosecutor sat down. Mr. Harlan rose with a stiffness that betrayed his own unease. He smoothed his tie, cleared his throat, and walked slowly to the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm but strained. Yesterday you saw something powerful, emotional, heart-wrenching. But I must remind you, emotion is not evidence. Tears are not facts. Sympathy cannot replace proof. He began pacing. The prosecution's entire case hinges on the words of a 3-year-old child. A child who, as we all know, is easily influenced, easily frightened, and easily confused. She whispered into a dog's ear and repeated what adults wanted her to say. That is not testimony you can convict a man on. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the jury box. Some jurors frowned, unimpressed. But Harlan pressed on. Think carefully. Did you see any physical evidence presented? Any concrete proof? Or did you see a performance carefully orchestrated to play on your emotions? Ladies and gentlemen, if you convict my client on this basis, you are not delivering justice. You are condemning a man based on sentiment rather than fact. He turned, pointing toward the defendant. This man's future rests in your hands. Do not let tears and whispers blind you to the standard of proof required by law, beyond a reasonable doubt. His words hung in the air, but they lacked the force they once might have had. His argument felt clinical, detached, cold in contrast to the raw truth of Emily's voice. When Harlan finally sat down, the silence in the courtroom felt heavy, not with doubt, but certainty. The jury deliberates. The judge gave his instructions. Then the jurors filed out to deliberate. The door closed behind them, leaving the rest of the courtroom in tense silence. Inside the jury room, emotions ran high. Some jurors spoke through tears, recalling Emily's tiny voice, her trembling finger pointing across the courtroom. Others pounded the table, furious at the defense's attempt to discredit her. She's 3 years old, one juror said firmly. 3. You think a child that age makes up details like that? Another shook his head. And the way she spoke, you could see it wasn't rehearsed. That was real. I'll never forget it. A few hesitated, clinging to the defense's argument about lack of physical evidence. We have to be careful, one woman said softly. The law demands certainty, beyond a reasonable doubt. What if? But another juror cut her off. What if nothing? That girl was terrified. You saw it. And then you saw the relief when she told the truth. I believe her. And I think you do too. The room fell quiet, but slowly nods spread across the table. In the courtroom, hours passed before the jury returned. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone filed back into their seats. Emily sat quietly with Max, too young to understand the weight of what was about to happen, but sensing the tension in the air. The judge addressed the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman rose, a folded piece of paper in his hands. His face was grave as he handed it to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. The courtroom held its breath. The judge opened the paper, read silently, then looked up. In the matter of the state versus David Harlan, he began, on the charge of aggravated assault against a minor, We the jury find the defendant. The silence was unbearable. Emily clutched Max tighter. Guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. The defendant's face crumpled, his shoulders collapsing, as though the air had been ripped from him. His attorney slammed his fist onto the table, but it was useless. The verdict was sealed. On the opposite side of the room, Emily's guardian sobbed openly, relief breaking through weeks of fear and uncertainty. Officers moved to restrain the defendant as the gavel fell again and again, silencing the chaos. Through it all, Emily remained curled against Max, whispering softly into his ear. And though the words were too quiet for anyone else to hear, the smile tugging faintly at her lips told the story. She was free. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after Emily finished speaking. That silence was not empty. It was heavy, full of meaning. The kind that comes when everyone realizes they have just witnessed something extraordinary. People shifted in their seats, jurors dabbed their eyes discreetly, and even the usually unshakable bailiff seemed to clear his throat with emotion. The judge, a man known for his stoic manner, leaned forward with a softness that few had ever seen. His gavel rested quietly in his hand, forgotten for the moment, as he looked at the little girl sitting beside the German shepherd. "Emily," he said gently, "you've been very brave today. You have helped this court understand the truth." Emily, still holding Max's fur, gave a small nod. She didn't smile, at least not yet, but her shoulders were no longer weighed down by fear. The dog licked her hand, almost as if to say, "You did it." The verdict, the trial, moved forward swiftly. With Emily's testimony, the final piece of the puzzle had been placed. The prosecutor presented closing arguments, weaving together the evidence, witness statements, and now the child's heartfelt words. The jury did not take long to deliberate. When they returned, the foreperson's voice carried the weight of justice. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." A ripple of relief passed through the room. Some people sighed audibly. Others clasped their hands together in silent gratitude. Emily, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the words, only sensed the calm that settled over the adults around her. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. And it came as she buried her face in Max's fur, as if the world was safe again, because her four-legged friend was still there. Reporters and headlines. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond the courthouse. Headlines appeared in newspapers and online. Bravery in the courtroom. 3-year-old finds voice with help of police dog. When justice had 4 paws, the canine hero of yesterday's trial. Tiny witness. Big courage. Television crews replayed footage of Emily walking out of the courthouse, her small hand gripping Max's leash with determination. People across the country were touched by the image of innocence finding courage in such an unexpected way. For many, this wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a lesson about empathy, trust, and the unique bond between humans and animals. A new beginning for Emily at home. Emily's life began to change. She still carried scars of fear, but her parents noticed something new. She laughed more, played more, and asked often when she could see Max again. Therapists explained that the dog had been more than just a comfort. Max had given Emily a bridge between silence and expression. He had been her voice when she couldn't find her own. The judge, deeply moved by the case, arranged for Emily to visit Max regularly at the police department. Each visit was a reminder that she was not alone, that her bravery mattered, and that justice had listened. The bigger impact Emily's case did not just end with a verdict, it started a movement. Courts across the United States began discussing the role of therapy and service dogs in legal settings, especially for child witnesses. Advocates argued that if a dog could help one frightened 3-year-old find her voice, then hundreds of other vulnerable children might benefit too. Lawmakers began drafting proposals, Judges invited handlers to their courtrooms, and police departments trained more dogs for such roles. Max, once just a hard-working police canine, became a symbol of this change. Max the hero. The police department honored Max with a medal, though he didn't understand the speeches or the applause. He only understood pats on his head. The treats slipped into his mouth. In the gentle way, Emily hugged him every time they met. To Emily, Max wasn't just a police dog. He was her friend, her protector, her listener. The closing scene months later. Emily's parents took her back to the courthouse, not for testimony, but for a small ceremony honoring her bravery. She wore a bright dress, her hair tied up with ribbons, and her small shoes clicked against the marble floor as she walked proudly next to Max. When the judge spoke, his voice echoed through the room. Today we honor not just a verdict, but courage. Courage shown by a child who proved that truth can be spoken in the smallest of voices, with the help of the most loyal of friends. The audience stood and applauded. Emily looked around, startled at first, but then smiled wide. She hugged Max tightly, pressing her cheek into his fur. A reporter asked her what made her so brave that day in court. Emily thought for a moment, her small face serious. Then she answered simply, "Because Max listened to me." And with that, the room fell silent again, not out of sadness, but out of awe. Those words, innocent and pure, held more power than any legal argument could. A story that lasted years later. Emily's story would still be told not just in newspapers, but in classrooms, training programs, and conferences about child advocacy. Judges, lawyers, and police officers often shared the account of the little girl who spoke to a dog in court. For Emily, life moved forward. She grew stronger, carrying with her not just the memory of fear, but the knowledge that courage could be found in unexpected places. Max remained her companion for many years, a living reminder that sometimes heroes have 4 legs and a wagging tail. Final words. The story closed where it began, in the courtroom. But this time, the room was not filled with silence, fear, or uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with hope, proof that even the smallest voice could change the course of justice. And all of it happened because a 3-year-old found the courage to speak to a dog named Max. And the world listened.